Most people think Moses was a hero. Chosen by God, raised in a palace, called at the burning bush, marched into Egypt, told Pharaoh to let his people go, parted the Red Sea, received the 10 Commandments on a mountain. It's the greatest leadership story ever told. The ultimate underdog who freed an entire nation. But here's the problem with that version. It leaves out the middle. And the middle is the part that actually matters. Because before Moses was a deliverer, he was a murderer. Before he was the voice of God, he couldn't get through a sentence without stumbling over his own words. And before he split the sea, he spent 40 years, 4 decades, in the middle of a desert, watching sheep, completely forgotten by the world he used to belong to. Moses wasn't chosen because he was qualified. And when you see what actually happened during those 40 years that everyone skips, this story stops being about a hero. It becomes about something much more uncomfortable and much more relevant to wherever you are right now. If you've ever felt like your best years are behind you, if you've ever made a mistake so big that you packed up your identity and walked away from everything, if you've ever looked in the mirror and thought, God can't use me, not after what I've done, then this isn't just Moses' story. This is the case study for every person who's ever felt disqualified. And I want to show you 4 things about Moses' life that most people never examine. 4 pieces of evidence that completely dismantle the hero narrative. And by the time we get to the 4th one, I think you'll see that Moses' story was never about a great man doing great things. It was about a broken man saying yes when he had every reason to say no. Let's start with who Moses actually was before the basket and the river and the rescue. Because the setup to this story is more complicated than most people realize. Moses was born during a genocide. Pharaoh had ordered the execution of every Hebrew baby boy in Egypt. Every one. His mother, Jochebed, hid him for 3 months, and when she couldn't hide him anymore, she waterproofed a basket, placed her infant son inside, and set him adrift on the Nile River. Think about what that took. She wasn't sending him to safety. She was sending him into a river in a country where Hebrew babies were being killed on sight. Yet she was gambling his life on the chance that someone, anyone, would find him before the current or the crocodiles did. Pharaoh's daughter found him. And she didn't just save him, she adopted him. Moses was raised in the palace, the royal palace of the most powerful civilization on earth. He would have received the finest education available: mathematics, military strategy, law, languages, architecture. According to Acts 7:22, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Catch that, powerful in speech. We'll come back to that, because something changes. Moses grew up as Egyptian royalty. He had every privilege, every advantage, every door open to him. He could have lived his entire life inside those palace walls and never looked back. But he knew. Somehow, he knew he was Hebrew. But he knew his people were slaves. And that knowledge created a fracture inside him that he carried every single day of his life in that palace. The tension of being treated like a prince while knowing your blood relatives are making bricks in the mud under the Egyptian sun. And one day, that tension broke. Exodus 2:11. Moses went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He looked this way and that. He checked to make sure nobody was watching. This wasn't a reflex. It wasn't self-defense. It was premeditated violence. Moses made a calculation. I can get away with this. And he was wrong. The next day, He tried to break up a fight between two Hebrews. And one of them said, "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out. Pharaoh heard about it and tried to kill Moses. Therefore, Moses fled. Out of Egypt, out of the palace, out of everything he'd ever known. A prince one day, a fugitive the next. And he ran all the way to Midian, a backwater region on the far side of the desert, as far from Egypt as you could possibly get. He married a shepherd's daughter. He started tending sheep, and that's where he stayed for 40 years. Now here's the part that nobody spends enough time on, because those 40 years are usually covered in a single sentence. Moses fled to Midian and became a shepherd. And then the story jumps to the burning bush. But you cannot understand the burning bush if you don't understand what 40 years in that desert did to Moses. But he entered Midian as a 40-year-old prince of Egypt, educated, powerful, capable, by his own estimation, ready to deliver his people. He tried it his way, with his fists, with his Egyptian training, with the confidence of a man who had been told his entire life that he was destined for greatness. And he failed spectacularly. He killed a man. He was exposed. He was rejected by the very people he was trying to help. And he ran. 40 years later, he was 80 years old. 80. In a culture where the average lifespan was far shorter than it is today, Moses was ancient. He wasn't a young man with potential anymore. He was an old man with a past. His Egyptian education was 4 decades obsolete. His military training was irrelevant in a land of sheep and scrub brush. His identity as a prince was a distant memory. And he wasn't anybody anymore. And if you've ever been in that place, the place where everything you thought you were has been stripped away, and you're left standing in the desert of your own life wondering what the point of any of it was, then you know exactly where Moses was standing when the bush caught fire. Exodus chapter 3. Moses is doing what he does every day, leading the flock of his father-in-law Jethro to the far side of the wilderness, and he sees a bush that is burning but not being consumed. He turns aside to look, and from the middle of the bush, God speaks. "Moses, Moses, here I am. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hides his face because he is afraid to look at God. For this is the man who was raised in the presence of Pharaoh, a man worshipped as a living God. Moses spent 40 years looking at power without flinching. But now, in the wilderness, 80 years old, stripped of every title and every credential, he covers his face. Something had changed inside him. The confidence was gone. The ambition was gone. The belief that he was the right man for the job, gone. 40 years of sheep and silence had done what Egyptian education never could. It had broken him. And that's exactly when God gives him the assignment. "I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." And here's where we get to the detail that changes everything about how you read this story. Because Moses doesn't say yes. He doesn't stand tall and accept the mission. He argues. He objects. He pushes back. The 5 times. Excuse 1. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Translation. I'm nobody. I'm an old shepherd in the middle of nowhere. I'm not the person I used to be. Excuse 2. What if they ask me your name? What do I tell them? Translation. I don't even know you well enough to represent you. How can I speak for a God I've only just met in a bush? Excuse 3. What if they don't believe me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to me? Translation. The last time I tried to help these people, They rejected me. What makes this time any different? Excuse 4. Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue. Now this is the one that stops me every time. Remember Acts 7:22? Moses was powerful in speech and action in Egypt 40 years ago. But now? Now he can barely get the words out. Some scholars believe Moses developed a stutter during his years in Midian, possibly from trauma, possibly from isolation, possibly from decades of speaking a different language. The man who was once eloquent in the courts of Egypt now struggles to form a sentence. Whatever happened to his speech, it happened during those silent years in the desert. The desert didn't just break his confidence, it broke his voice. And excuse 5, the most honest one of all. Exodus 4:13. Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. Please send someone else. That's not humility. That's not modesty. That's a man looking at the God of the universe and saying, I can't. I've tried. I failed. I killed someone. I ran. I'm old. I stutter. I am not your guy. And here's the part that most people gloss over. God gets angry. Exodus 4:14. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. God, the patient, compassionate, slow to anger God of the Bible, gets frustrated with Moses. Because Moses is standing at the most important crossroads of his life, and his past is telling him to say no. But God doesn't withdraw the assignment. He doesn't say, you're right, I'll find someone else. He accommodates. He gives Moses his brother Aaron to speak for him. He gives him signs to perform. He gives him everything he needs, not because Moses is ready, but because Moses is available. Barely, reluctantly, but available. And that reluctant, stuttering 80-year-old shepherd walks back into Egypt, back into the country that wants him dead, back into the palace he fled from 40 years ago. And he stands in front of the most powerful ruler on earth and says, through a stutter, through Aaron, through a voice that no longer sounds like a prince, the God of Israel says, let my people go. And Pharaoh laughs. But God doesn't. What follows is the most devastating display of divine power in the Old Testament. 10 plagues, each one targeting a specific Egyptian deity. The Nile turns to blood, an assault on the god Hapi. Frogs blanket the land, an assault on the goddess Heket. Darkness covers Egypt for 3 days, an assault on Ra, the sun god. And the final plague, the death of every firstborn. An assault on Pharaoh himself, who claimed to be the son of the gods. Moses doesn't perform these plagues through his own power. He doesn't lead through charisma or military strategy. He leads by showing up, raising his staff when God says raise it, and getting out of the way. Watch the man who once tried to free his people with his fists now frees them by lifting a stick. And then the sea, the moment everyone remembers. The Israelites are trapped, the Red Sea in front of them, Pharaoh's chariots behind them, mountains on both sides. No way out. And the people turn on Moses. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? And Moses, the same man who stuttered through 5 excuses at the burning bush, says, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Where did that confidence come from? Not from Egyptian training, not from royal education, not from natural eloquence. It came from brokenness. Yeah, and it came from 40 years of desert silence that burned away every shred of self-reliance, and replaced it with one thing: dependence on a God who shows up when you've run out of options. Moses stretches out his hand. The sea divides. The nation walks through on dry ground. And when the water crashes back over the Egyptian army, the man standing on the far shore is not the prince of Egypt. He's not the murderer from Midian. He's not the eloquent young leader from Acts chapter 7. He's an 80-year-old shepherd with a speech impediment and a stick. And he just led 2 million people to freedom. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Wasn't the Egyptian education part of the plan? Didn't God put Moses in the palace because he needed someone trained in leadership and diplomacy? Maybe the 40 years in the desert were just a detour, and it was always the palace training that qualified him. But here's the thing. If Egyptian training was the qualification, God would have sent Moses at 40. He was at the peak of his abilities at 40. Educated, strong, connected, powerful in speech and action. But God waited until Moses was 80, until the training was irrelevant, until the speech was broken, until the confidence was dust. God didn't use the prince. He used the shepherd. He didn't use the man at his strongest. He used the man at his emptiest. And that's not an accident. That's the point. Because this isn't a one-time anomaly. This is a pattern God runs through the entire Bible. Joseph, gifted, favored, full of dreams, had to spend 13 years in slavery and prison before God used him. David, the anointed king, had to spend years running for his life before he sat on the throne. Gideon, told he was a mighty warrior, was threshing wheat in a winepress, hiding from the Midianites when the angel found him. Peter, the rock on which the church would be built, had to deny Jesus 3 times before he was ready to lead it. Paul, the most influential apostle in history, was a persecutor who spent 3 years in the Arabian desert after his conversion before he wrote a single letter. The pattern is always the same. God breaks before he builds. He empties before he fills. He waits until the person is completely out of options, out of confidence, out of backup plans. And then he moves. Not because he's cruel, because he needs them to know without any ambiguity that when the sea parts, when the walls fall, when the impossible happens, it wasn't them. It was him. Moses' story was never about a hero rising to the occasion. It was about a man who had already tried to be the hero, failed catastrophically, spent 40 years living with that failure, and then discovered that the failure itself, the murder, the exile, the stutter, the shame, was the curriculum. The desert wasn't a detour. It was the degree. Everything God needed Moses to become, he became not in the palace, but in the wilderness. Not in power, but in poverty. Not in the years of speech and action, but in the years of silence and sheep. The Moses who split the Red Sea was not a better version of the Moses who killed the Egyptian. He was a different person entirely, and a person who had been emptied of every human qualification and filled with one divine one, the willingness to say yes when everything inside him was screaming no. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth hiding inside this story. You don't have to be ready. You don't have to be healed. You don't have to have your past figured out, your speech polished, your reputation cleaned up. Moses stood in front of Pharaoh with a criminal record, a speech impediment, and 40 years of irrelevance on his resume. And God used him to change the course of human history, not despite the brokenness, through it. If God can use a stuttering murderer who spent 40 years hiding in a desert to free an entire nation, then whatever you think disqualifies you doesn't. It never did. And the desert you're standing in right now, it might not be a punishment. It might be the preparation. If this changed how you see Moses, The story of David goes just as deep. A boy nobody believed in who killed a giant everyone else was afraid of, and then spent years running for his life before he became king. That full story is right here. And if you're not subscribed yet, we do this every single week.